Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go, free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking. I'm your host, Sheri Horn Hasan of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on November 17th, 2022 from Contact Talk Radio. Just a quick reminder that this podcast aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. Before we start with this week's Astro News you can use, I'm going to run through my usual housekeeping stuff, which is simply to tell you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime by simply going to my website at karmicevolution.com and clicking on the upper right-hand portion of the banner labeled podcast. From there, of course, you can scroll down the page and click on the archived recordings to hear the most recent show, and or to search the archived listings for past shows which you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And just so you know, the show drops every Thursday at 11 a.m. Pacific time and 2 p.m. Eastern time. So again, you can listen live or anytime. And while you're on that page, you'll see the most recently posted show, plus a link for a downloadable freebie labeled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy. And this is friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our specific sun sign, actually needs to be happy. It's based on an interview I did with Steve a couple of years ago, and he's given me permission to distribute it more widely as a means of promoting the validity of astrology in our lives. And yes, it will sign you up for my weekly Conversations About Consciousness astrology newsletter, but you can, of course, unsubscribe anytime. So be sure to grab it when you listen to this podcast, again, whether you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page at Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use, and on Instagram at karmic.evolution. So please feel free to follow me there as well. Thank you. In addition, I'm offering still my 1-hour discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading to listeners only for only $99. So if you're interested in astrology and want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, which is essentially a snapshot of the exact position of the planets at the precise moment and location of your birth, this chart reveals a great deal about you. And if you'd like to choose to use it as a tool for soul growth, a Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading can be tremendously helpful if you want to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, if you'd like to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back in areas of concern, such as relationships, careers, finances, and or health, then a natal chart reading of this nature can lead to the understanding and healing of old karmic wounds and help you to co-create your own future happiness and success through astrological insight. Yes, as I like to say, this is easy when you take advantage of my 1-hour, $99 discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for listeners only. At almost half the regular price, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. And you can find easy access to this offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic99. And finally, the Astrological Society of Princeton is now taking signups for my new evolutionary astrology class, which is titled Fate, Free Will, and Your Soul's Evolution. And this class is for those who want to learn to delineate or read charts from the evolutionary astrological perspective, and to learn more about the truth about past life karma and one's soul's evolution. So during this 8-week course, you'll learn how to decipher and synthesize how the nodes in the chart by sign, house, and aspects, as well as the sign, house, and aspects to and from the rulers of both the north and south nodes, tell one's past life story and how this influences one's present life. Now, this class is designed to help you move from chaos to clarity through astrological insight, again, by learning your soul's true purpose based on the nodal structure, to decipher what's blocking you now based on what I call past soul conditioning, and how understanding all of this allows you to overcome blockages and succeed in problematic areas in this lifetime, such as relationships or career, finances, and or health. So if you'd like to learn to read your own or others' charts with a focus on how what seemed to be faded from the past can be overcome through free will in the future, then this class is for you. Now, the class will begin on Monday, January 23rd, so I'm giving you lots of heads up. It'll take place Monday nights from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and it'll run for 8 weeks. And yes, recordings will be available after the fact for anyone who can't make it or has to miss sessions. So for more information and or to sign up, please go to ASPNJ, that's Astrological Society of Princeton, New Jersey.org. And of course, feel free to email me at Sheri, that's SHERI, at karmicevolution.com if you have any questions about the class, as I'll be happy to answer them for you. All right, so now let's get on to this week's Astro News you can use. So I strongly believe that many of us are now breathing a sigh of relief and have begun to, release a lot of our anxiety, which was wrought by our fear of sudden unexpected surprises leading up to and since the Taurus Full Moon lunar eclipse, which of course involved Uranus very heavily on November 8th. Now, it's funny how Uranus works, right? I remember astrologer Michael Luton saying that whenever Uranus is involved, whatever you can imagine or think won't happen, because Uranus is the planet of unexpected change, is probably part of what's going to happen, right? So in other words, if you expect one thing, it definitely won't happen, because what's going to happen must be something unexpected, and that's by virtue of Uranian energy, which is known as the change maker, and unexpected shocks and surprises when it's present in the chart, either natally or in something like an important lunation and eclipse. So that we expected one thing or one outcome, but got another, that was the surprise, right? So yes, I'm talking about the U.S. midterm elections, which so many had either anticipated or feared would be a GOP landslide, the thought of which triggered much trepidation and anxiety about the future, especially for women in this country. Obviously since the Dobbs decision, the Supreme Court Dobbs decision that came down last June, June, I forgot now, May 24th, I think it was. Anyway, instead, however, the shocker, which defied most political pundits' predictions and expectations, was that a pattern was broken and reality differed drastically from expectations to a certain extent on both sides of the aisle. I mean, normally during a midterm election, the U.S. House and Senate swing to the party opposing that of the current administration. So in this case, of course, the fear was that recent tradition would hold and both houses of Congress would become predominantly Republican, as an antidote, for lack of a better word, in their minds, to a Democratic administration. So let's dissect a bit now that some time has passed, because I think my last show was only 2 days after the election, and there were many elections that weren't yet called at that point. So let's dissect a bit what actually happened since the Taurus full moon conjoined with Uranus at the November 8th lunar eclipse. And while many feared the Taurus moon-Uranus combination would herald a negative change, now is a good time to remember what Michael Luton has given us astrological advice, which is that Uranus energy doesn't necessarily mean bad or negative. It simply means different, unexpected, and sudden, and involves a change. So most astrologers like to say that when it comes to Uranus, we should expect the unexpected. Whether that unexpected turns out to be positive or negative is based on our individual perceptions, and it always remains to be seen. I mean, I'd add here as well that whenever something shocking happens to us, it may rock our world for a while, but often, and at a much later date, we come to see how it makes sense and may have actually changed our lives for the better. So now Uranus transiting through Taurus since the spring of 2018 has already signaled a long-term change in societal values. This we know, and in part because I've already explained it in previous podcasts, but we're still in the midst of such change in values and will be at least until Uranus first dips his toe into Gemini circa April 26, 2026. So a bit more time left for Uranus to continue to change our social value system between now and then, right? And remember, Uranus takes 7 years approximately to go through each sign of the zodiac. So let's also remember now that the moon represents our emotions. It's our inner child. It tells us what we need to feel secure. So it stands to reason that the moon-Uranus conjunction at this last lunation in Taurus could herald a sudden change in values, that's the Taurian part, based on people's emotions. That's the moon. Remember, in mundane astrology, the moon represents the people. Meanwhile, these two opposed the Sun, Mercury, and Venus in Scorpio, calling them to release their need to control others, particularly through secretive or hidden financial deals, known in politics as dark money, and instead bring greater Taurian peace and stability through greater balance to the forefront. So the unexpected change resulted not in a landslide or a tidal wave for one side or the other, but rather a greater balance between the two. And I think that's pretty interesting, you know? So it's no surprise also that change occurred with this last lunation, since full moons are always about release. And in this case, we're asked to let go of our scorpionic resistance to holding on to all of the power, as well as to an adherence to the unwavering belief that both the House or U.S. House and Senate would change hands, because that's what they've always done during this country's recent history during midterm elections or as a result of midterm elections. So the party in power, meaning currently the Democrats, feared that history would repeat itself this time around too. And there's a lot also inherent in the fact that Venus, which ruled the moon and, you know, through which Uranus is transiting at this lunation, at this moon-Uranus meetup, was asking the Scorpio archetype to give up its need to control Mother Nature and all of her natural cycles. Now, I've mentioned that before in the context of Venus and Uranus and the change in values, but here, yes, I'm talking about the feminine divine and the ability to procreate by choice rather than by rule or decree of a state or an institution. So this lunation apparently said, when we look at it in retrospect, it's not nice to fool Mother Nature. And so Mother Nature restored a proper balance, at least here in the U.S. Inherent in this is the dismissal of the desire or the scorpionic desire for incessant transition or transformation, based again on the use of other people's money. So in essence, what the Taurus Moon Uranus asked us to release was our reluctance to let go. Like I said, remember, Scorpio is a fixed sign of the belief that money can buy and sell, or read, control the values, ethics, read, the very soul of the people, rather than these things being determined by natural cycles. So what we've seen this week as the monthly lunar cycle continues to wane is that our worst fears of being deluged by this red tidal wave did not manifest, though neither did any wishful thinking or hopes for a miracle win, I mean, that may be tempered a little bit. It's sort of status quo in terms of the Senate, but I'll get into that in a minute. So instead, as late called race results have been coming in daily for over a week now, we've seen balance returning to our lives. And if that's not part of the miracle of the divine feminine's natural cycles, I really don't know what is. So what did we get, or what were the results of this lunation in political terms? Yes, the Democrats lost the House, as was just announced yesterday, but only by a couple of seats, not a red tidal wave. As it stands right now, the Democrats have won 211 seats in the House, while the GOP gained a majority of 218. There are a total of 435 seats in the House of Representatives, so these concluded races now total 429, meaning there are 6 seats left still to be decided. Now, again, nowhere near the predicted red tidal wave, right? So meanwhile, the Democrats managed to not only hold on to the majority of the 100-seat Senate with 50 seats, but it may possibly make it 51 seats, thus moving the Democratic-ruled Senate beyond its tie-breaking capability, and that will depend on the outcome of the Warnock-Walker runoff in Georgia on December 6th. So if Warnock wins, that's 51 Democratic senators to 49 Republican ones, and a vice president's tie-breaking vote becomes far less necessary. Now, let's remember, too, that the House holds the purse strings, and the Senate is the confirmation body for high-level cabinet nominees and others in the administration, including, of course, judges. So we already know that during Trump's administration, with the help of Senate leader Mitch McConnell and his White House counsel Don McGahn, that many conservative justices were both nominated and confirmed between 2018 and 2020 because the GOP held the Senate after the 2018 midterm elections, even though the Democrats controlled the House. Now, however, this election switcheroo allows the Biden administration, which thus far since Senate control switched to the Democrats in 2020 and has appointed more liberal judges to the bench than since JFK was president, it's allowed Biden's administration to continue to nominate and confirm more such justices. So the fact that the Democrats won the Senate now means that President Biden will continue unfettered in his ability to nominate judges for senators to confirm for at least another 2 years, and without the threat of GOP obstruction. Now, one of the messages as we move towards Sagittarius this month can be seen through the expansion into a more equal judiciary system since the last administration, again, appointed a record number of conservative judges, including the 3 Trump appointees confirmed to the Supreme Court during his term. And it's been reported to date that Biden, again, since winning election and taking office in 2021, as I just said, has thus far appointed more judges than Trump and any other president since JFK. And whether Biden runs again in 2024 or not, he's still got 2 more years left now during his 4-year term. So that's important to note as we're heading now into Sagittarius season, which, because it's ruled by Jupiter, clearly has a lot to do with higher law, as well as since that period of GOP Senate domination brought us 3 right-wing Supreme Court justices under Trump. So meanwhile, and despite our current court situation, opportunities have already arisen this past week for us to investigate these kinds of reforms, as well as reform in our own lives due to this Jupiter-influenced restoration of faith. And this, in turn, allows us to imagine a better future now, which I think is very much a result of Mercury and Scorpio's sextile to Pluto in Capricorn, and the Scorpio Sun's trine to Neptune in Pisces just a few days ago, because they occurred on November 14th and 15th. And as the dust settles and we begin to deal with our new reality, we can see how Venus in Scorpio's trine to Jupiter retrograde in Pisces on November 15th, and her entrance into Sagittarius on November 15th or 16th, depending on your time zone, and this is where Venus will remain until December 9th, has already broadened relationship horizons and left many of us more optimistic about the future. Now, what am I talking about specifically? Well, my example is easy to see, which is that yesterday, November 16th, it was reported that 12 GOP senators crossed party lines to support same-sex marriage. And this is, and of course there's a Uranian component here, right? Because Uranus is different, right? Uranus and Taurus, if I want relationships that are different from the norm, well, it's nobody's business but my own. So this is from the New York Times from yesterday. And I quote, Senate takes crucial step toward protecting same-sex marriage rights. The Senate held a key test vote on Wednesday on legislation to allow federal protections for same-sex marriage, with 12 Republicans joining all Democrats to help move it through the current 50-50 chamber. In one of their first major agenda items in the post-election season, Democrats moved fast to enact the bill. Which would repeal the Defense of Marriage Act, which denied federal benefits to same-sex couples while their party still controls both chambers. Should the bill pass the Senate in a vote that is expected after Thanksgiving, it would need to pass the House in its revised form before being sent to President Biden to be signed into law, and Biden has already indicated he will, in fact, sign it. The push in Congress, I'm still quoting from the Times, the push in Congress to codify marriage protections came after Justice Clarence Thomas suggested in an opinion overturning abortion rights, this was back in May, June, that the court, quote, should reconsider, unquote, past rulings that established marriage equality and access to contraception. Now, I'll break in here to say something I've already said, which is that Justice Clarence Thomas's hypocrisy is somewhat astounding, especially since by his reasoning of repealing or reconsidering a lot of these past precedent rulings, the court could also look at intermarriage between races, which is something that would nullify his marriage as a black man to a white woman. But, whatever, right? Justice is blind, but in the wrong way in this case. So the Senate on Wednesday took a crucial step toward passing landmark legislation to provide federal protections for same-sex marriage. And the Respect for Marriage Act is now on track to become law in the twilight of the Democratic-held Congress. Again, this is from the Times. The 62-37 vote, which came only days after the midterm elections in which Democrats retained control of the Senate, but were on track to lose the House of Republicans, which has happened as of yesterday, was a rare and notable last gasp of bipartisanship by a lame duck Congress as lawmakers look toward an era of political gridlock in a divided Washington. Democrats made the same-sex marriage bill one of their first major agenda items in the post-election session, moving quickly to enact it while their party still controls both chambers. Now, I can only say, and I'm not sure where things stand, that it would be certainly a hopeful, optimistic, dream, maybe, that they do the same to codify Roe versus Wade. But I think, I'm guessing there's a lot more opposition to that, even on some of the conservative Democratic side. So though we'll hear more about that soon. But meanwhile, Mercury ingressed into the sign of the Archer early today on November 17th, where he stays until November 6th. So between Venus and Mercury both being in Sag now, these two will cause us to think more positively with a kind of the sky's the limit type mentality, as well as potentially add some greater bombast to our rhetoric. And mental insights can expand toward a myriad number of future possibilities that, when combined with sharp organizational efforts, allow us to rethink adjusting down the volume of previously martial rhetoric due to the Sun's quincunx to Mars in Gemini and Mercury trine Jupiter retrograde from also November 15th and 16th. We got a number of trines to Jupiter this week, and, that can put us a little bit over the top. But as I'm going to discuss, it'll be tempered a little bit by Mars square to Neptune for the second time this year. So I think we'll continue to think boldly and big as Mercury enters Sag today. And the November 18th, which is tomorrow, the Sun's sextile to Pluto will provide opportunities to enact positive change in negative circumstances with which we put up for too long in the past. But we have to be aware of letting fantasy trump reality as Mars retrograde in Gemini makes its second square to Neptune in Pisces, also retrograde, on November 19th. And, I've said this before, I wrote about it. It's up to us to decide whether to lead with bombastic, fantastical, reality-denying, wishful thinking. So you see how we can take that Sag energy and it can be applied kind of sideways to Mars square Neptune, right? Which is to say, we overestimate, we're overly optimistic, we go above and beyond in ways that have no realistic, practical, reality-based, concrete possibilities. And, we have to keep it tempered a bit so that whatever it is we are dreaming about proves to be able to be concretely manifested in the real world. And this brings me to another Uranian change that was heralded by the Taurus Full Moon lunar eclipse, and that's the crypto crash and the major layoffs at social media, algorithm-ruled companies like Twitter and Meta. And it seems like a scale is being balanced in this realm too. Now, I don't claim to understand cryptocurrency, but I do understand that the biggest crypto venture of all just went belly up. And this is according to today's New York Times, and here I quote, FTX collapsed last week after a run on deposits exposed a deep financial hole in the business. Last Friday, the company filed for bankruptcy and its chief executive, Sam Bankman-Fried, resigned. The collapse has kicked off investigations by the Justice Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission focused on whether FTX improperly used customer funds to prop up Alameda Research, a trading firm that Mr. Bankman-Fried also founded. Now, I just heard this morning that I think that FTX was a $32 billion company. All right? I mean, get your mind around that, right? In addition, my understanding, which is somewhat gleaned, I've mentioned her before, but, I'm not a financial astrologer, so don't take this as don't take anything I say about her as advice. I'm just sort of relaying what she said. But it's gleaned from Susie Orman, is that FTX was a global company, a global entity and endeavor, and it actually had attracted only 1% of its investments or ownership by Americans. 1% of 32 billion, you do the math, right? So I suppose that's good news, but certainly not for those 1%, right? But it's interesting to note that this crypto company slide began on the day of the eclipse, which was November 8th. As for Twitter and Meta, needless to say, massive layoffs, 7,000 employees at Twitter, or approximately 25% of its workforce, and 11,000 at Meta, which is approximately 13% of its workforce, have occurred within the past week or so. Add in Amazon's recent announcement that it's laying off 10,000 employees in both corporate and technology, which will represent a 3% cut to its corporate division, which, according to Reuters News, and here I quote, oh no, not yet, hold on. What I want to say myself is that miscalculations due to the eccentricities of Twitter's new owner, Elon Musk, and Mark Zuckerberg's neglectful disregard for Meta's basic business social media model, through his insistence on dumping billions into virtual reality development over the past few years that no one asked for and seemingly no one wanted or wants, instead. So here is a quote about Amazon, according to Reuters news outlet, which is from November 14th. Quote, Amazon.com is planning to lay off around 10,000 employees in corporate and technology roles beginning this week. A person familiar with the matter said on Monday in what would amount to its biggest such reduction to date. Now, the cuts earlier reported by the New York Times would represent about 3% of Amazon's corporate staff. The exact number may vary as businesses with Amazon review their priorities, the source told Reuters. The online retailer plans to eliminate jobs in its devices organization, which makes voice-controlled Alexa gadgets and home security cameras, as well as in its human resources and retail divisions, the person said. Amazon's time frame for informing staff remained unclear. The source attributed the reduction to the uncertain macroeconomic environment faced by Amazon and other companies. The news follows a wave of layoffs across the technology sector, which is wary of recession after years of rapid hiring. Just last week, Facebook parent Meta, as I already said it would cut more than 11,000 jobs, or 13% of its workforce, to rein in costs. On a call with reporters last month, CEO financial officer, this is Amazon's officer, Brian Olsavsky, said the company saw signs of tighter household budgets for shopping, and it continued to wrestle with high inflation and high costs. So, end quote. Sudden shifts in what folks value paying their hard-earned money for, right? All of this pretty much in the past week or so coming out in the news since the Taurus Full Moon lunar eclipse, which very heavily involved changemaker Uranus. So let's look ahead now as we continue to think boldly, as I said, and big. When Mercury enters Sag today, he already entered this morning, and again, he'll be there till December 6th, and the November 18th Sun sextile to Pluto, which will provide opportunities to enact positive change, as I said before, in negative circumstances that we may have dealt with or put up with for too long. And again, the caution is to beware letting fantasy trump reality as Mars retrograde makes its second square. The third one will be in 2023, in March 2023, to Neptune. And that square, remember, echoes the U.S. Sibley chart, which has a natal Mars square Neptune in it, which I kind of attribute to America's optimistic, America's already a Sun, Venus, Jupiter in Cancer, so it's optimistic by nature, although that's tamped down by its square to Saturn in the Sibley natal U.S. chart. But also that Jupiter rules the ascendant. It's a Sag ascendant in that chart. Now, not every astrologer agrees with that chart, but I definitely do. So the nation's an optimistic one, and through that optimism, it may be prone to fantasy. And that's the manifest destiny, which was certainly true when settlers first got here and thought that the continent extended forever, as well as our kind of glorification of heroes and things like that, putting people up on a pedestal who we vote in to rule over us, and things of that nature. I mean, I've talked about this before, so it's really up to us to decide now whether we want to lead with bombastic, fantastical, reality-denying, wishful thinking, or to use these energies now to create a realistically better future. And that's especially true because, again, the Sun is going to trine Jupiter on November 20th, and that will provide an easy path for us to understand bigger patterns that can then allow us to apply greater foresight to the potential possibilities that planned future changes can bring now. And this, in turn, may well affect our future financial planning, as the move into Sagittarius energy might denote higher interest rates still when the Federal Reserve meets again in December, which in turn seems already to be resulting in a slight lowering of inflation or the consumer price index based on the lessening of consumer demand. That's most prevalent in the housing market right now, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is not to sound like I know anything about finance, but to say that the lunation on November 8th changed our expectations. We got, in some cases, more than we thought we would, and in others, far less, depending on which side of the political spectrum one hails from. But at the same time, we're heading into this period of optimism, right? So how optimistic are our aspirations or our expectations with this Mars square Neptune, which is in play really off and on, for another good number of months and has been in play for a while. So we want to ground that, right? If we get overly excited due to Jupiterian pie in the sky somewhere over the rainbow enthusiasm, we can overshoot the mark. And that's why I think it's very important that what's going on right now in Congress is that the Democratic-controlled House and Senate, until the House switches over to Republican control in 2023, will do all that it can. So the expansiveness there is they're going to throw a lot of things on the table and try and pass as many as they can. The other issue that I didn't mention, which is of the utmost importance, is the electoral count reform, which is already in the works in Congress and which will change the rules in the sense that it will make more clear that the vice president has no hand in choosing which electors, state electors, to accept and which to reject in the certification of a presidential vote or any other vote, and that it will, I guess it's just presidential, I guess the electoral votes, but in any case that this will also tighten those regulations. The other thing they're looking at is not allowing state legislatures to interfere with the electors, and to put disputes not in their hands, but in the hands of judges. So now we come full circle to see the importance of Jupiter and the whole congressional makeup and affiliations, right? So emotions can combine with our intellect, which will make it easy for us to express love and affection when Mercury joins Venus in Sagittarius on November 21st, and we gain a greater aesthetic appreciation of the patterns inherent in our world and our life at this time. And this, in turn, buoys the Sun into Sagittarius season, which begins November 22nd and will last until December 21st, when the Sun moves on into Capricorn, and represents a time period during which we enter the holiday season. So our, especially in the northern hemisphere, right, northern and western, our optimism, enthusiasm, and confidence expand now, especially, of course, because Jupiter becomes the ruler of the November 23rd Sagittarius new moon, which actually trines Jupiter, Sagittarius's, right, ruler, which can benefit us greatly, both personally and collectively, again, as long as we don't lead with Jupiter and Sagittarius's shadow side, which is excessive arrogance, or what the Greeks called hubris, think Donald Trump, and I'm say no more, or over optimism now, which I've mentioned. So when the Sagittarius new moon occurs at 1 degree 36 minutes of the sign of higher consciousness, it will be at 2:57 p.m. Pacific and 5:57 p.m. Eastern on November 23rd, we're offered the opportunity to plant seeds of greater faith in our future. Now, it's interesting to note that the past two lunations, which I talked about last week and I believe the week before, which include, of course, the October 25th Scorpio new moon solar eclipse at 2 degrees Scorpio and the November 8th U.S. Taurus Full Moon lunar eclipse at 16 Taurus, which occurred on November 8th, had a dearth of fire in the sky, or showed a dearth of fire in the sky elementally. So as I've discussed in past weeks, a lack of fire in both the sky and a natal chart can indicate a kind of mania. And traditional astrologer Bernadette Brady's description of the Saros series cycle of the set eclipses was, she described them as having, quote, a manic flavor. So what did we see? One of the largest turnouts ever, where voters did not swing toward making both the House and Senate into the majority party in opposition to the party of the current administration. Obviously, we're talking here, about what I've already mentioned. So, again, optimism has returned to those who support continued Democratic majority rule, and the seeds of the future were also planted, and something I want to mention, when Maxwell Frost became the first Generation Z member of Congress. He was elected to a congressional district in Central Florida, and I think it's really important because I think it's important to mention because I think it's the wave of the future, and this is part and parcel of Uranus and Taurus also having a hand in the election day lunation, right? Frost became an anti-gun activist after surviving the Parkland, Florida school shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School there. And he says he became involved in keeping schools safer from the proliferation of guns as far back as when he was 15 and the Sandy Hook, Connecticut shooting occurred. So he's also, his big issues are climate change, gun control, and what's the other one? Women's rights, duh. And also, I believe, he's a progressive, right? He's young. I mean, this is what we're waiting for. We're waiting for Congress to get rid of all the old fogies. Like Chuck Grassley, who just won his seat at 89 years old. Personally, I think he's just assuming he's going to either retire or die, and then, hope that he's got a Republican governor who will replace him with a Republican. But in any case, so again, as I said, that Mars square Neptune is also, because both planets are retrograde, is helping us rethink how we want to communicate about many important issues. And, that it's also kind of shown us that, people like Trump and others who are pretty fanatical, or MAGA members or whatever, who want to cry fraud in federal, state, and local elections and encourage the martial attempt to guard ballot drop boxes and polling places with firearms and, threatening stances. And, the fact that failed to intimidate enough voters who are highly motivated to protect women's rights in particular and civil rights in general. All I was going to say about Frost is that I'm sure he is pro protections for the LGBTQ community, transgender rights and so forth. So this Mars-Neptune square was juxtaposed against these other things, right? And it didn't materialize in the way that they thought it would, because it was not grounded in reality to begin with. So our ability to dig deeply into what's fact versus what's wishful thinking can also be a result of the Scorpio Sun sextile to Pluto that just happened on November 18th, because it brings to the surface stronger motivating focus on societal reform. Pluto is very much about societal reform than with daydreaming, fantastical desires about controlling others. Now, the Sun's exact watery trine to Jupiter retrograde in Pisces November 20th reminds us that it's easier to achieve what we need rather than solely what we want. especially when what we think we need is actually based more in quicksand than in concrete physical reality. Now, again, Jupiter's purpose is not to bring us all that we desire, which is what I call what we think we need. Rather, Jupiter's archetypal purpose, and by attachment Sagittarius energy, is actually to provide us with what our soul truly needs. So if what we need now, at least on the domestic level, is an evenly divided House and Senate, especially as we're in the midst of our first U.S. Pluto return here in the U.S., this may speak volumes on a more symbolic level about how democracy is still working, at least more than it's endangered right now. And I want to mention something that I talked about a long time ago, which was basically the Saturn square Uranus, which perfected 3 times in 2021 and came close again around the September-October leading up to this midterm election season. And I had said, because I was recounting the mythology of Saturn and Uranus, right, which is Uranus, that Saturn won. So without going back into the whole myth right now, because I don't have that time and it's easy to look it up, is that I said the center would hold. Now, I wasn't necessarily referring to democracy at that time, but I think it was an interesting quote-unquote prediction, or forecast, that the foundation would hold. And so I do think that that has come to fruition, at least at this particular moment in time, based on the most recent outcome of the most recent election. So, and that, of course, doesn't mean that we can count out the triggered Jupiter, Neptune, and Pisces energy from last spring that is still, I think, has lessened the boundaries between religion and law, right? As I've also mentioned on previous podcasts, and are also related to Jupiter and Sagittarius energy, and Neptune, along with Jupiter's current retrograde period, which he's now coming out of. So he's stationing direct on... he's stationing direct next Thursday, a week from today. Next Wednesday on the 23rd, in conjunction with the Sagittarius new moon. And the Sagittarius new moon, which again is wide trine to ruler Jupiter, is basically giving us the optimistic stance, but Jupiter's turning direct. So when Jupiter turns direct, he's now engaging in making manifest what we needed rather than what we thought we wanted. So I want to make sure that that is clear. And Jupiter will continue to do so, especially during the Sagittarius season now. Now, the other thing that's interesting at this lunation is that Mercury, Venus, the Sun, and the Moon will all be in Sagittarius, right? Because they're all going to be pretty much grouped together at the lunation, the Sagittarius new moon. And they're all approaching trines to Chiron, wounded healer Chiron in Aries, indicating the possibility for some healing rhetoric communicated particularly in partnerships. Now, I think, although some might say it's too early, I think we're feeling that in the bipartisanship that we just experienced, that I mentioned in the Senate over the Same-Sex Marriage Act, or whatever the actual name of it is. So the Moon, Mercury, and Venus will perfect their trines to Chiron and Aries from Sagittarius on November 24th and 25th, while the Sun won't culminate his until December 4th. So, it's easy to see how this could be perhaps a healing period, right? We all know that Thanksgiving's coming on November 24th, and this is a period, whether we're going to attribute it to astrology or not, that historically has heralded the most traveled day of the year in the United States. And it, the Sag new moon will kick off on the 23rd, the day before, when a lot of people are traveling to the holiday period, again, particularly in the Western and Northern world, as we head toward Thanksgiving, towards Hanukkah, to Christmas, to Kwanzaa, and New Year's Eve soon. So visiting family and friends on Thanksgiving, right? As we are going to be leading into these trines by all these planets, personal planets in Sagittarius, might say that we'll come together with friends and family with whom we had previous disagreements, and at the best begin to look towards the future optimistically on both sides, and at worst simply agree to disagree rather than to argue ad nauseum over turkey and stuffing. Now, I think I neglected to say also that on November 21st, which is the day before, or actually a couple hours before, like 12 hours before the sun enters Sagittarius on the 22nd of November, that Mercury and Venus join together in Sagittarius. So again, there's a bit of a heralding of this more optimistic, friendly, discussion that won't deteriorate into people wanting to kill each other over things like politics or religion or whatever. Now, it's usually a harmonious kind of thing, and I had mentioned that we're sort of more intellectually oriented in terms of our aesthetics. But I just want to point out the timing there because it may hopefully bode well for our holiday Thanksgiving, at least here, to kick off the whole holiday season. And this may prove particularly true because on November 28th, Mars in Gemini retrograde will trine Saturn in Aquarius, this airy trine, which is a bit more of an intellectual one, that may allow us to, rather than go off half-cocked, as my father used to say, with Mars energy being impatient and impetuous at its worst, right? It will be tempered by this trine to Saturn, which will enable us to focus and to do the hard work. And particularly because Mars is retrograde in Gemini, the hard work may be restraining ourselves from screaming and shouting about, anything. But you know where I'm going with that, right? So, and it can happen on both sides, right? It's like, well, somebody might be shouting about how the Democrats rigged the election, while someone on the other side might be screaming and shouting about how dare you vote down women's rights, So it just depends on what side of the aisle you hail from. All right, so that is it for today. I just wanted to remind you that if you're interested in a $99 1-hour reading, by all means, hit me up at Sheri, Sheri, at karmicevolution.com, or go to karmicevolution.com/karmic99. And if you're interested about more information on the upcoming Fate, Free Will, and Evolutionary Astrology class, by all means, drop me a line at the same email, Sheri at karmicevolution.com, and I'm happy to answer your questions. If you are interested in signing up for it, you can go to ASPNJ, that's for Astrological Society of Princeton, New Jersey.org. And I look forward to hearing from you. And meanwhile, thanks to everyone for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, November 24th, for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and and free to go. Open up the book.